After a week of unprecedented unrest in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, questions are being asked about the root causes of the violent and deadly acts. The disappointing scenes seen on television and social media networks last week went further to highlight levels of poverty that many black communities experience on a daily basis. To talk more on this, we're joined by Nomfundo, Mogapi, who's the founder and CEO of the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Let's talk then about what kind of response, will be appropriate by those in positions of leadership at a time like this, because we saw varying responses. We saw some leaders really being emotional, others not even going to the ground immediately as and when required, while others were simply just silent. What then becomes the response of the leaders and those in power during a time like this?
Evening, Bongiwe. Yeah, it is indeed difficult times for our country. And we need different perspective and interventions. We do need interventions at a political level, socio-economic, and even, of course, at a security level. But I'm really coming from an end of someone who has been working with issues of trauma and wounding in our country for the past 30 years and arguing that we need to also integrate the trauma lens and how we respond to this. And there's a number of things that I think we can do. The first one is things that need to be done urgently, and I will touch on some of those. But Bongiwe, just in advance, I really want to highlight that it's not just enough for us to spend all our energy to deal with the matter now when it is urgent. Because in South Africa, we tend to hear and panic when there's violence. And after the violence, we go back to our ordinary life as if the very same thing that drove that violence don't exist. So in the immediate term, one of the things that we know is that we are in a very triggered state emotionally as a society. And when we are in that state, we look for the familiar. We've seen in places like Johannesburg how having community leadership that people are used to speaking to the people is much more powerful than having external leaders that people feel disconnected to, or even might hold some anger towards. So I think there's a role of supporting those within the communities that are already respected, whose voices is familiar to the community. And we have to support them around how to bring about messaging that de-escalates the violence rather than actually fuel it. So even as we look towards accountability, how do we hold people to account without using shaming names like these are criminals and hooligans that actually feed into the very same shame that is brought up here as a society? And how do we really hear the concerns on the ground, show that we are really concerned about it without, again, agitating people towards more violence and saying that those concerns are justifying? And we've really been seeing leaders who would either maybe been careless or not being conscious or fully appreciating the depth of trauma and woundedness in this society, actually agitating people more towards violence. So these are some of the things that really we need to look at. And South Africa has galvanized towards restoration, and I think it's great that we're looking at how we are going to restore our society, including businesses and communities. Again, in that restoration, whether it is going to be food or helping businesses, let us integrate the psychological components on how to contain this trauma that has been ruptured by what has happened in our country.
And there can't be talk of healing without also looking at the unresolved trauma that some are still walking around with. I'm not sure if you were able to hear me, Nomfundo, to say that we, as a nation, we can't talk about restoration, as you say, that there's now even talk of restoration and how South Africa moves forward without delving deeper into the issue of unresolved trauma.
Yeah. No, thanks, Bongiwe. I missed you a bit there. So I think, of course, definitely it is critical to look at how we move back, because people have to have jobs again, businesses need to start. But I think we really need to balance between the project of the restoration and also saying that the restoration and us galvanizing bringing food and bringing the police is not enough. There are long-term issues that need to be addressed. We were talking, for example, a few days ago with the SI, the social corporate investment sector in South Africa, saying to them that it's no longer sufficient for us to only bandage some of these issues in our country. We need to look at more long-term interventions that are
It looks like that line to Nomfundo, not a great one there, as we look at the trauma, this unresolved trauma that she's talking about, and how important it will be that at a time like this, especially when the country has seen some of these disturbing scenes. Nomfundo, I do understand you are back with us, as we were talking about the importance then of resolving this trauma that remains unresolved.
Definitely. Sorry, these are the challenges of this new era with that thing. Yes, definitely. And by resolving this trauma, we are not saying that everyone must now go to therapy. What we are advocating for is that we use the trauma lens. For example, with what we started with Bongiwe, how do we support our leadership to appreciate the psychological architecture of our society and the psychological state of the communities that they have to work with, and enabling that we are integrating those. When people are going to give food into the communities, you know, those frontline people, how do we give them skills so that they can play the role of emotional containment in the communities, but also know where to refer those people to? So we have to integrate these approaches, but there is a longer term process that we need to deal with. The first one, is shifting the psychological architecture within our ruling party. And I've been saying this over and over, that unless we really shift the psychological mechanisms that help our ruling party to win the struggle, and now say, what does it mean to be a ruling party that is governing, we will continue to have this problem. So there's work that needs to be done there. There is serious work that needs to be done around socioeconomic transformation. And for us, the socioeconomic transformation is not just about socioeconomic transformation, it's also about understanding the interlinks between this deep trauma and the agency around socioeconomic issues. If people are re-experiencing the very same trauma that their parents used to experience in the past, and there's no hope that they can get out of it, and how can we link these two together? So we need all these aspects of our society to be addressed in order to ensure that we don't find ourselves in the same situation that we are in now.
And when you look at what has been circulating on social media and also on television channels, other people have been saying, I can't watch anymore, it's too traumatic, and I'm not even able to have some kind of an outlet, because wherever I go, I am really faced with this. And then coupled with that, residents who would have witnessed the looting in their communities and some of these disturbing scenes, and they themselves were not involved. These are all traumas that will lead to people really just feeling like they're just hopeless at a time like this, and having nowhere to go, and not having an outlet in order to be able to deal or process what they are seeing. What would you then advise someone like that tonight to say, how do you have a moment where you are just taking a moment to just breathe and forget even about what you've just seen, if it is even possible to forget?
Yeah, but I think when you enter a territory where you don't even have a language and what you are going through is almost unspeakable, you have entered indeed the territory of trauma. And what we know about the trauma experience is that, first of all, it looks for a witness. It looks for a place to be heard and witnessed. Trying to shout those emotions and not feel them doesn't necessarily help. So it's important for us to surround ourselves with people where that won't feed necessarily and be even more angry, but where we can share our frustrations, and also remember the people that are in other places that may not have the luxury of those connections, and see how we can play a role either in supporting community-based organizations that are offering emotional support, some of the religious organizations, because that's really what is needed. Trauma also looks for a home. It looks for a place that can hold that pain. So as I go back again to leadership, that there are people in communities that are playing very important leadership roles. Some of them are really tired and exhausted. How can we galvanize support for giving them debriefing, for giving them support so they can have much more capacity to contain other people wherever they are at? And I think really finally, if you do have the luxury of being able to go for help, because what has happened might have also triggered your own trauma and your own pain, especially if you are a manager or a leader in your own organization. Some people have to go back to businesses. I really would like to appeal that you find ways of how you can create more psychological safety within the organizations that you are managing, but also deal with your own trauma, because we know that when leaders themselves are traumatized, they've already been stressed by COVID-19, and they come into the workplace with that trauma, they are likely to exacerbate the trauma within the organizations. If you are a parent or a mother and you know that you are stressed, you are likely to be more agitated at home, create more anxiety. Our children are seeing these things and hearing these things. So taking care of ourselves and our own healing, learning to pause, talking to caring, supportive people. And if it's too much, if you are not able to sleep at all, you are struggling with your eating, reach out. You know, if you've got a medical aid, get psychological support. And if you know people in the places that are affected, it is as cheap as just picking up a call and saying, how are you? What is going on? I know it is very difficult to sit with other people's pain, but it can make such a difference when there is a caring person on the other side listening to your pain.
All right, Nomfundo, thank you so much for your time tonight. We certainly do hope that people heed your advice then to reach out for help. That was founder and CEO of Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership, Nomfundo Mogapi, talking about a very important subject of healing and just processing then the trauma that we even have witnessed in recent days.